Hi, and welcome to Viewmaster Travels. Today we're visiting the locations from Reel 287, White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. White Sands is a unique national park, both for its amazing natural beauty and because it's entirely surrounded by the U.S.'s most active missile testing range. This episode's a difficult one. White Sands' ever-moving dunes make matching old pictures today pretty much impossible. I ended up hiking much of the park looking for anything that looked similar to my Viewmasters. The park is here in southern New Mexico, and it contains the world's largest field of gypsum sand dunes. Sand 30 feet deep and dunes 60 feet high. Like we saw at the Petrified Forest, this area was once under a shallow sea. This part of that sea's floor formed thick layers of mineral gypsum, and as the Rocky Mountain Range rose up from tectonic plate collision, the gypsum-rich seafloor formed gypsum-rich mountain ranges. Eventually, the plates began to spread apart, creating two parallel mountain ranges and a deep basin between them. Rainfall and snowmelt dissolved gypsum from the mountains and washed it down into the basin, where the water eventually evaporated, leaving gypsum crystals behind. The strong, consistent winds broke up the gypsum crystals, forming sand, and blew it into ever-moving sand dunes, forming the dune field we see now. This cycle continues today, continuously replenishing the dunes with fresh gypsum sand. Driving in, we could see the dunes in the distance, with the blowing sand rising miles into the sky as we approached our first Viewmaster destination. The Administration Building. The Visitor Center building is the same as it was when the Viewmaster picture was taken in the 1940s. It's of the same Pueblo revival style we see all throughout parks in the Southwest. The sign out front still calls it a national monument. It became a national park just 6 years ago, and I guess it'll take a while to update the sign. It took 15 years of effort, starting in 1918, to get the site listed as a protected monument, and much of that was due to one man. Tom Charles was a newspaper reporter from Kansas who moved to the Alamogordo area in 1907 and enjoyed picnicking in the dunes with his family. Over the next 10 years, several efforts were made to make the whole area a recreational park, but those plans failed. Charles realized he needed to convince people that the value of the gypsum sand was nothing in comparison to the value of visitors coming to the area. He said, "Do we want to sell the Great White Sands at 5 cents per ton or at $21.50 per inspiration?" Finally, in 1932, he convinced U.S. Senator Bronson Cutting of this, who recommended pursuing the easier national monument status, and they convinced President Hoover as well, who created the White Sands National Monument and made Tom Charles its first custodian, paying him a salary of $1 per year. This all happened at the lowest point of the Great Depression, when the average New Mexico worker's income was only half the national average. However, attendance was unexpectedly high, and Charles took advantage of Roosevelt's New Deal opportunities to build the Visitor Center, ranger facilities, and a road into the dunes by the mid-30s. Visitors to the park would experience any number of unique natural wonders. A yucca keeps its head above the sands. White Sands is a unique location in the world, and as much as it's a desert, it's also an oasis. There's water just inches below the surface. This lets thousands of species of animals live in the dunes, and 45 of them are unique to White Sands. Most famous of these is the bleached earless lizard, which is a subspecies of the common green lizard, but white sands lizards are unique because they are white. As the gypsum dunes formed, green lizards became easy targets for predators because they stood out against the white sand. Baby lizards who happened to be lighter colored were harder to see and were much more likely to survive and reproduce. 3,500 generations later, and you only have white lizards in white sands. This change from green to white took place in just 7,000 years, a blink in evolutionary terms, adapting right before the eyes of early humans who walked these very dunes. And how do we know early humans walked these dunes? Because their fossilized footprints were found in the park. One set shows hunters following a giant sloth. Another set shows a mother and a child on a walk, meeting a mammoth and returning home. Research is ongoing, but it's likely these are the oldest human footprints ever found in North America, dating back 23,000 years. Walking was one way to see the dunes, but our next Viewmaster picture shows a more unique way to see the park. The thrill of a roller coaster in special car. Well, you can't do this anymore, but you can get a sled and try and slide down the dunes, which didn't work well for us. These dunes don't act like regular sand dunes. The first weird thing to me was that, even in the desert heat, this sand is cold. Gypsum doesn't absorb heat well, keeping it cool to the touch. It's also covered in a hard crust that you have to break up to get to the fine sand, which is soft and doesn't scratch you, so it's easy to climb and walk on. And it's intensely white. Pictures can't really convey just how bright and white it all is. The area today, as it was in the 30s, is a giant playground with almost unlimited space and hundreds of picnic areas, and you can see from their design how the strong winds must always come from the same direction. The new National Monument was a huge success, the most visited park in New Mexico, eventually getting featured prominently in National Geographic, and because of that, in 1941, a record 73,000 people visited. But all that was about to change. Center of 176,000 acres of white sand.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
Within weeks of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army established the Alamogordo Army Air Base and the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range, basically turning White Sands into an island surrounded by military development. The influx of soldiers and their families kept attendance at the park strong through the war years, although Regional Park Director Charles Ritchie warned, "We should also be very careful and not let the Army gradually expand its use at White Sands so that they feel they can do as they please there." The vast, empty spaces of the Tularosa Basin north of White Sands became the ideal test site for the military's most important secret weapon project ever. On July 16, 1945, The U.S. Army detonated the first nuclear weapon at the Trinity Test site, just 55 miles north of White Sands National Monument, initially claiming the enormous explosion was the result of an accidental detonation of an ammunition storage magazine. The Manhattan Project quickly brought the war to a close, but it also opened a new and frustrating chapter for White Sands. Ripples in the sands ever-changing. We visited the park over 2 days. The first was sunny, clear, and hot. The next was overcast, windy, and cold. We hiked seemingly endless ranges of dunes, and that evening watched an amazing sunset. After the war, the dunes faced a new kind of invasion, not by tourists but by missiles. The Army brought home parts to assemble over 100 German V-2 rockets and decided to see how they worked at the White Sands Missile Range. Each test required evacuating the park, and at their peak, the park had to be closed for 2 days out of every 3. The frequent interruptions were one thing, but the occasional accidents were another thing entirely. One time an errant missile crashed into the picnic grounds, destroying tables, benches, and a shelter. Another time, a warhead accidentally separated from the missile and crashed right next to the visitor center. The missile program eventually gave way to the space race, and testing began at White Sands for NASA's Apollo program. The Park Service found NASA much more cooperative, but the interruptions continued for the next 50 years. Strange formations carved by the winds. It's difficult when visiting the dunes to really know what you're going to see. Everything changes all the time, and we never saw anything like this. This is a giant sumac plant growing on a hardened pedestal of solidified gypsum. The plant's roots have grown way down into the water table, letting it live even after the dune it was originally sitting on has moved on. Meanwhile, at the Trinity Test site, the historical significance of the area had become obvious, and in 1953, an open house was held to allow the public to view the site. Keep in mind, this was a secured test site within a secured missile range hidden deep away in the desert. 650 people attended. In 1965, an obelisk was built out of local stone at Ground Zero, and the open house became an annual occurrence. I'd known that you could visit the Trinity site since I was a kid. There were just 2 days a year you could do this, and only for a few hours each day. Visiting Trinity was kind of like a scientific pilgrimage. We arranged our Viewmaster travels to White Sands around the open house, but at the last minute, the Army canceled it. 6 months later, another opportunity came up to visit, so we drove 2 days back through the desert in hopes of seeing Trinity. We joined hundreds of other people on our way into the missile range. The cars all line up, waiting for the gates to open, so we had plenty of time to talk to other people there. The people in front of us were scientists from Chicago whose entire lab staff had driven 4 days across country for this chance. So maybe I wasn't as crazy as I'd thought. Eventually the gates opened and the convoy drove through the base to the parking area. It was a cold, rainy, windy day, and we joined hundreds of other people in line for our turn to stand next to the stone obelisk. There were thousands of people there throughout the day, and the weird thing was that we were all there to stand in a big empty field, significant only because of its connection to a moment in history. A delightful playground. It's a strange juxtaposition, the peaceful, beautiful, sandy playground just 50 miles away from the site of one of the most cataclysmic events in human history. There's a little more to see at Trinity other than Ground Zero. You can explore the McDonald Ranch House, used as a home base before the test to prepare and assemble the bomb. Plus, there's several people there helping interpret what you're seeing, and talking to them was fascinating. They explained that one side effect of the bomb was that the sandy surface of Ground Zero fused into radioactive glass, which early visitors would break apart and take home. It's now called Trinitite, and this is the only place on Earth that exists. The Army decided to bulldoze all the remaining Trinitite into trenches and bury it in the early 50s for public safety, and then when the site became protected, it became illegal to remove any more. There were scientists there with samples of it showing its radioactive properties. Understanding the Trinity site is difficult. Thousands of people traveled thousands of miles to stand at a specific spot in the middle of the New Mexico desert, each there for their own personal reasons, I suppose wanting to connect to a profound instant in history. In 2019, White Sands National Monument became White Sands National Park, a status that grants the park protected funding from Congress. To do this, they gave up some of their land to the Army, and in return, the hope is that missile tests won't have to shut the park down as often. White Sands as a place of conflicts, timeless yet ever-changing, empty but full of life, peaceful yet shaped by war. It's a fascinating place to visit, and I hope you get the opportunity to do so. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching.